The signal was not supposed to exist. That was the first thing Assessor Dara Vell noted in her log when the detection alert came through at 300 station time, pulling her out of a sleep that had been uneasy for reasons she could not have named. She sat up in her bunk and read the alert twice, and then sat with it for a long moment in the dark before she got up, dressed, and walked the empty corridor to the monitoring station. The corridor felt different at this hour. Quieter than silence, the way deep space facilities sometimes felt when the ambient sounds of a working institution had stilled and left only the mechanical breathing of life support systems doing their steady, indifferent work. She had been stationed at the Galactic Core Listening Array for 3 years, and she had made this walk perhaps a dozen times on late alerts that turned out to be equipment anomalies, gravitational interference, the ordinary noise of a universe that was large and busy and frequently produced sounds that resembled signals without being them. She did not think that was what this was. She sat down at the primary detection console and pulled up the raw data. She looked at it for a long time. She ran the standard authentication protocols, which took 11 minutes, and returned a result she had never seen in 3 years and had not expected to see in her career. Well, she sat back in her chair. Outside the viewport, the galactic core burned in its ancient, indifferent way, 10,000 stars compressed into a brightness that never fully resolved into individual points of light. She had stopped finding it beautiful in any simple way after the first few months. It was too large for beauty. It was the kind of thing that required a different word. She looked at the authentication result again. Then she opened a channel to the director's quarters and woke him up. "Sir," she said when his face appeared on the screen, rumpled with sleep and already reading the alarm in her expression. "I need you in the monitoring station." "What is it?" She had been trained to be precise in all communications from this facility. Precision was the institutional value that the array held above all others: precision in detection, precision in documentation, precision in reporting. Speculation was not encouraged. Claims were not made until they were supported. She was precise. "A signal," she said, "authenticated, confirmed non-natural origin, transmission source is the outer spiral arm." She paused. Origin coordinates match the former location of the Sol system. The director was very still. "That system," he said carefully, "has been dark for 500 years. "Yes, sir," Dara said, "it has." The history of humanity's disappearance was taught in schools across the galactic community, in the way that significant and unresolved historical events were taught thoroughly in the facts, carefully in the interpretations, and with a kind of institutional caution about conclusions that had persisted for 5 centuries, because no conclusion had ever been adequately supported by evidence. What was known was this: humanity had been a member of the galactic community for 160 years when the silence began. 160 years of contact, of trade frameworks and diplomatic relations and cultural exchange, and the slow, imperfect, genuine work of building understanding between species that had evolved under very different conditions. Humanity had been young by galactic standards, a civilization still in early development, still working through the internal tensions that young civilizations worked through, still making the kinds of mistakes that older civilizations had learned to recognize and younger ones had not yet learned to anticipate. But they had been present, fully, unmistakably, characteristically present, loud in their engagement, generous in their curiosity, occasionally frustrating in their tendency to approach problems from angles that made complete sense only to them. The galactic community had not always known what to do with humanity, but it had known for 160 years where to find them. And then, over the course of approximately 4 standard years, they were simply gone. Not destroyed, there was no evidence of destruction. No debris fields, no radiation signatures consistent with weapons deployment, no distress signals, no emergency transmissions, no record of any conflict that could have produced an extinction event of the necessary scale. The outer settlements went silent first, one by one, over the span of 2 years. Then the inner colonies. Then the homeworld itself, not suddenly, not catastrophically, but gradually, like a light dimming rather than being extinguished. The last confirmed human transmission had been received 503 years ago. It was a routine commercial message from a trading station near the edge of the sector humanity had occupied. It concerned a cargo manifest. It was not, as far as anyone had ever been able to determine, in any way unusual or final or aware of itself as a last word. After that, silence. Consistent, complete, and despite 5 centuries of investigation by every major civilizational body with the resources to mount one entirely unexplained. The leading theories were numerous and none was definitive. Voluntary withdrawal, pursued by some faction of researchers who pointed to certain patterns in the final years of human activity that might indicate preparation. Catastrophic civilizational collapse from internal causes, the kind of rapid destabilization that had claimed other young civilizations before and since. Technological transcendence, the hypothesis that humanity had developed something in the years before the silence that had taken them somewhere, or made them something that was no longer detectable by the instruments the galactic community had available. Migration to a region outside the mapped galaxy beyond the range of any monitoring system. None of these theories had evidence sufficient to be accepted. None had been sufficiently disproven to be discarded. 500 years later, the academic field dedicated to the question of human disappearance was active, contentious, and had produced an enormous body of work that its practitioners considered significant and its critics considered elaborate speculation. And then, at 300 station time at the Galactic Core Listening Array, the question became a different kind of question. Director Shan Marath arrived in the monitoring station 14 minutes after Dara's call and read the authentication result, and did not speak for a long time. He was 61 years old. He had spent 30 years in deep space monitoring, the last 8 as director of the array, and he had the quality that long careers in quiet, patient, important work sometimes produced, a stillness that was not absence but depth. He did not react quickly to things. He thought about them. He thought about this for a long time. "Walk me through the authentication," he said. Dara walked him through it, every step, every result, every parameter that had been checked and the result it had returned. It took 22 minutes. Marath asked questions at 4 points, precise technical questions that confirmed he was following the process rather than the conclusion. When she finished, he was quiet again. "Run it again," he said. "I ran it twice before I called you. Run it a third time." She ran it a third time. It took 11 minutes. The result was identical. Marath looked at the authentication result. He looked at the origin coordinates. He looked at the signal characteristics, the specific pattern of it, the frequency, the structure. "It's modulated," he said. "Oh yes. Not a beacon, not a simple presence signal." "No, sir, it contains structure. Layers. I haven't begun decoding. I wanted you here before I opened any processing on the content." Marath nodded. He pulled up the signal characteristics on his own console and studied them. "The modulation pattern," he said slowly, "it's not current galactic standard." "I know. It matches the transmission protocols documented in the historical record." He paused. "Human transmission protocols, pre-silence." "Oh yes, sir." Marath sat back. "Someone," he said, "has sent us a signal from the Sol system in a 500-year-old human transmission format, after 500 years of silence." Oh, yes, sir. Using equipment or a transmission method that produces an authenticated non-natural origin signature. Oh, yes, sir. He looked at the viewport, at the galactic core burning outside as it had burned through all 500 years of silence, as it had burned before humanity's arrival in the community and through their presence in it and through the long uncertainty since. Wake everyone, he said, and put a hold on outgoing communications. Nothing leaves this station until we know what we're dealing with. Sir, the reporting protocols require. I know what the protocols require. I'm not violating them. I'm invoking the provision for delay pending verification in cases of extraordinary significance. He looked at her. I think this qualifies. She looked at the authentication results. Oh, yes, sir, she said. I think it does. It took 7 hours to assemble the full decoding team. 6 of them, pulled from sleep or off-shift rest, arriving in the monitoring station with the particular alertness of people who had been told enough to know that alertness was warranted, and not enough to know what they were walking into. Marath briefed them. He was precise. He did not editorialize. He presented the detection data and the authentication results and the signal characteristics, and he said, in the same flat professional tone he used for everything, that what they were looking at was a signal of confirmed non-natural origin from the coordinates of the former Sol system, in a pre-silence human transmissee. On format, received after 500 years of silence from that region of space. The room was very quiet. Then the lead decoder, a Verath scholar named Assessor Preen Vila, who had been with the array for 12 years and who was, Dara had always thought, the most technically gifted person on the staff, said, "Let me see the structure." Vila worked. The team worked. Dara watched and assisted where she could and mostly tried to stay out of the way of people who were better at this specific task than she was. The signal was layered. This became apparent in the first hour of analysis. It was not a single transmission but a structured sequence, not random layers, not noise, but a deliberate architecture that revealed itself as they worked through it. The outermost layer was what had triggered the initial detection, a simple, clear, authenticated transmission signal, the galactic equivalent of a knock on a door. Beneath it nested was something more complex. Vila said at the 3-hour mark, "It's a document." The room looked at her. The signal contains an encoded document, text-based. Long, she paused, working, very long. How long, Marath asked. I don't have a final count, but we're talking about something that was composed over time. This isn't a transmission assembled quickly. The internal structure, she stopped. The internal structure shows editing, revision, layers of composition over what I would estimate based on the encoding characteristics as a significant period of time. How significant? Vila looked at him, decades at minimums. The room absorbed this. Someone, said Assessor Yaron Dahl, the array's historian who had been pulled from sleep with the others and who was standing very still near the back of the room, has been writing this for decades, and has just now sent it. That's what the evidence suggests, Vila said. Why now, Marath asked, not to anyone specific, to the room, to the question. Nobody answered, because nobody had an answer. And in this room that was understood to mean the question remained open and should remain open until the document itself was decoded. Keep working, Marath said. What else is in the layers? There were 3 layers beneath the document. The second was a key, an encoding key that would allow the document to be fully deciphered, which suggested that whoever had sent this had anticipated that the document would require assistance to read and had provided the assistance within the transmission itself. This was, Vila noted, a form of courtesy. It assumed that the recipients would want to read the document but might not have the necessary tools. It gave them the tools. The third layer was navigational data. Coordinates, not the Sol system itself, but a point in space approximately 40 light-years from it. a specific location precisely rendered with what appeared to be orbital parameters for something at those coordinates. The fourth layer was the simplest and the most difficult. It was an image. Not a complex image. A single photograph, the format Assessor Dahl confirmed after 15 minutes of examination, consistent with human photographic technology as it had existed in the period before the silence. It showed a room. A small room simply furnished with a window. Through the window was visible a landscape that was, even to eyes that had never seen it, recognizable from the thousands of images in the historical archives of Earth. It was a terrestrial landscape, green and brown, with the particular quality of light that filtered through an oxygen-nitrogen atmosphere and struck surfaces that had evolved to reflect it in specific ways. A landscape from a living world. There was a figure in the room, seated at a surface that might have been a desk facing away from the camera toward the window. The figure was small in the frame. The image was composed to show the room and the view with the figure as one element among several. But it was unmistakably there. The figure was a human. The report went out 12 hours after the initial detection, after Marath was satisfied that the verification was complete and the documentation was thorough, and that what was being reported was exactly what the evidence showed, no more, no less, with every interpretive claim clearly labeled as such. The report was 40 pages. The authentication data was attached in full. The signal characteristics were attached. The three data layers, key, coordinates, navigational parameters were attached. The image was attached. The document itself was not attached because the document was not yet decoded, and Marath had decided, after consultation with his team, that the document should not be transmitted piecemeal. When it could be transmitted in full, it would be. Until then, the existence of the document was reported, and its decoding was reported as in progress. The report went to the Galactic Institute, to the Federation Council, to the major civilizational embassies, to the Department of Civilizational Assessment, to the academic bodies that had spent 5 centuries studying the question the report was about. And then the array went quiet, not the silence of the Sol system, not the 500-year silence that had shaped the galactic community's understanding of absence, but the particular quiet of a place that has said what it has to say and is now waiting for the response, and also in parallel continuing to work. The document took 11 days to fully decode. It was long, longer than Vila's initial estimate had suggested. A text of extraordinary length composed in the pre-silence human language called English, which was not the only language humans had used, but had been, by the time of the silence, the most common for formal and cross-cultural communication. Dara was not on the decoding team. Her role was monitoring, not analysis, and once the initial detection and authentication work was complete, her professional function was to watch the instruments and log the ongoing signal characteristics and make sure nothing changed in the transmission that should be reported. She did this. She did it well, and she did it thoroughly, and she was also, in the hours that the decoding team worked in the room down the corridor from her monitoring station, not entirely present in her work in a way that she acknowledged to herself, and monitored carefully so that it did not affect her performance. She was thinking about the figure in the photograph. Facing the window, the landscape visible through it, the room simple and small and furnished with the things a person needed, the quality of light, the composition of the image taken by someone, given to someone, included in a transmission that had been composed over decades and sent after 500 years of silence. She had grown up knowing the human disappearance the way everyone knew it, as a historical fact, as an open question, as the most significant unresolved mystery in galactic history. She had not before this week known it as something that might have a continuation, a next chapter, a photograph of a room with a window and a figure facing the light. On the 8th day of decoding, Vela appeared in the door of the monitoring station and said, You should read some of this. Dara looked at her instruments. Everything was stable. Can it wait 20 minutes? I think you should read it now, Vila said. Her tone was precise as it always was. But there was something in it, not emotion exactly, or not only emotion. Something closer to the quality of a person who has encountered something they were not prepared for and has not yet finished the process of being changed by it. Dara set her monitoring to alert and followed Vila down the corridor. The document was not what any of them had expected. Not in content, they had not known what to expect in content, so it was difficult to say what the expectation had been that the content failed to meet. But in form, in the quality of it, in what it was. It was not a report, not a formal communication, not an official statement or an institutional record or a diplomatic instrument. It was a letter. A very long letter, composed over what the internal dating evidence suggested was slightly more than 40 years, in the voice of a single writer who was identified only by a name, a human name, a common one, which the historical records confirmed had been in frequent use before the silence. The letter was addressed in its first line to anyone who received it. And then it begins. The writer described, in the particular way of someone who has decided to be entirely honest rather than strategic, what had happened. Not what had happened to humanity as a species. That story, the writer said early in the document, was larger than any one person could tell and was in any case better told through the documents that would follow this one if this one was received and responded to. What the writer described was what it had been like. The experience of the silence from the inside. What it had meant to the people who had lived through it, and the people who had been born into it, and the people who were children of those people. Growing up in a world that was very different from the world that had sent its first messages into the galaxy. The writer wrote about loss, about the specific losses of contact, of community, of the sense of being part of something larger than the single species on the single world. About the generations that had grown up without it, for whom the galactic community was not a present reality but a historical fact, the way that very old things are historical facts, real, but belonging to a past that felt like a different kind of time. The writer wrote about what had been kept, the languages, not all of them but many, the music, the knowledge maintained and transmitted and added to across 5 centuries of isolation, the long labor of people who had to. Cited that what humanity knew should not be lost simply because the circumstances of knowing it had changed. The writer described libraries, physical libraries, buildings devoted to the preservation and accessibility of accumulated human understanding, maintained across 5 centuries with the seriousness of people who understood that what they were maintaining was not just information, but the continuous thread of a civilization's self-knowledge. The writer wrote about the children, about what it was like to raise children in a world that was and was not what it had been. About the questions children asked, the ones that were easy and the ones that were not, the ones about what had happened and the ones about what would happen and the ones that didn't have answers yet and might not for a long time. The writer wrote about hope, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that required a specific expectation to be fulfilled. The steady kind. The kind that persisted across 5 centuries and had been transmitted from person to person and generation to generation not through formal institution, but through the particular human mechanism of one person telling another person, in the ordinary course of shared life, that the future was still worth preparing for. And at the end, after 40 years of writing, after a document that was longer than any single person could read in a day, the writer said this. We are still here. We did not know when the silence began, how long it would last, or whether it could be ended, or whether the galactic community would still be there to receive a signal if we sent one. We know some of those answers now. We do not know all of them. We are sending this because we believe, we have always believed, even through the centuries when belief required more effort than confidence, that the silence was not the end of the story. It was a chapter. A very long, very difficult, very costly chapter. But a chapter. We are sending this because we are ready, if you are, to find out what comes next. The writer's name was at the bottom of the letter. Below the name was a single line. It said, "We have been waiting to hear from you." Dara read the final pages standing up, because she had stood up at some point without noticing, and when she finished, she remained standing for a long time. The monitoring station was very quiet. Through the viewport, the galactic core burned. She thought about 500 years, about the weight of 5 centuries of silence, carried not by institutions but by people, by the specific named individual people who had lived through it and raised children in it and kept libraries open and maintained languages, and transmitted, in the ordinary human way of transmission, the belief that the future was still worth preparing for. She thought about the figure in the photograph, facing the window, the landscape visible through it, the light. She thought about what it meant that someone had written for 40 years, carefully and honestly and without knowing if it would ever be read, in order to give the receiving civilization, whichever civilization, whenever they received it, the full account. Not the strategic account, not the version composed to produce a specific diplomatic outcome, the honest one. She went back to her console. She pulled up the navigational coordinates from the third layer of the signal. The point in space 40 light-years from the Sol system, with its orbital parameters, its precise and careful location data. Something was there, something they had placed there or built there or arrived at and wanted found. She flagged the coordinates for the investigation team that would already be assembling somewhere in the galactic community, in the offices and meeting rooms of people who had just received the same report she had helped produce, and were now asking the same question she was asking. What do we do next? The answer, as best she could formulate it, sitting in the monitoring station at the galactic core listening array in the early hours of a morning that had been very different from the morning she had expected when she went to sleep, was this. You respond. After 500 years and 40 years of a letter and a photograph of a room with a window and a figure facing the light, and coordinates for something that was waiting to be found, you respond. In the same honest way the signal had been sent, without strategy, without management, without the careful construction of a first impression. Honestly and in full, and with the acknowledgement that 500 years was a long time, and that whatever came next would need to be built from the beginning, and that beginning again, even from silence, was something the galactic community and humanity had both done before. She opened the response template on her console. The cursor blinked. She thought about the writer's last line, 40 years of writing, 500 years of silence before that, the stead. Why kind of hope transmitted person to person across the generations? She began to type. She wrote 2 words. She looked at them for a moment. They were the right words. They were the only words in this moment that were both true and adequate to the weight of what they were responding to. Not diplomatic words, not institutional words, just the words of one civilization speaking across silence to another, which was all this had ever been. She sent them. Across the galactic core, across 500 light-years of the space that had been quiet for so long, the response began its journey. 2 words. We're here.